Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming out on this wonderful day to the historic McFarland Hubbard House, headquarters of the West Virginia Humanities Council, for the second in our little lecture series of 2022. This year's series is a themed series. It's first in our history. The title is A More Perfect Union, and each of the lectures in the series aims to explore issues of civic engagement and civics education as part of a series of programs leading up to the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States of America. This 2022 Little Lecture Series is presented through support by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Today's speaker will be familiar to anybody who's even looked, even briefly, into West Virginia history, and we're very delighted to host him. Joe Geiger is a former director of the West Virginia State Archives, a position that he held for nearly 15 years. Joe joined the State Archives in 1998 and served variously as webmaster, historian, and assistant director before moving to the big chair in 2007. For 20 years, he was an adjunct instructor in the history departments of Marshall University and West Virginia State University. He's a contributor of many articles in popular and scholarly publications on a variety of topics, and is the author of 3 books, including Holding the Line, Confederate Defense of the Staunton-Parkersburg Turnpike, 1861 to 1862, and his most recent book, which came out in 2020, Disorder on the Border, Civil Warfare in Cabell and Wayne Counties, West Virginia, 1856 through 1870. Joe's love of history is both a field and a process, is plain to see. If you ask Kyle Warmack, in fact, the council's program director, about working with Joe, he'll be glad to tell you about whenever a member of the public wandered into the state archives, maybe to look up just their family's genealogical records, Joe would immediately drop whatever he was doing and help out that member of the public. It's very fitting, then, that Joe should be a featured speaker in this year's series in particular, which seeks to spark discussion about civics and the responsibilities of citizenship, and much more. Please join us in welcoming former state historian and state archivist, Joe Geiger. Joe.
Thank you very much, Eric, for that kind introduction. I want to say thanks to all the members of the Humanities Council staff and praise them for their hard work. I'm very thankful to be invited to participate in this little lecture series. And I also want to thank each of you for taking the time on this beautiful day to come in and listen to somebody ramble about history for an hour. So I don't know if I could do that, but thank you so much for coming. I really do appreciate you being here. Some months ago, Kyle Warmack, and I want to thank you, Kyle, also for the invitation, spent a good bit of time doing research in the Archives and History Library, and I noticed that my book, Disorder on the Border, was sitting on his table quite frequently. And so eventually we struck up a conversation about his research, and he asked me if I would be interested in presenting a lecture on election controversies and disputes during the Reconstruction period, focusing on events particularly included in my last publication. I was delighted to be asked, and I've spent the last 3 months doing research and trying to put together a lecture that would be of interest to you today. And this topic really hasn't received the attention that it deserves. And I'm certainly not an expert in the Reconstruction period. In addition to my previous research on Cabell and Wayne Counties, the Reconstruction period there, I also used several secondary sources and then went through the Borman papers at the State Archives, looking in particular for correspondence relating to registration boards and the difficulties they faced and the problems that they caused in enforcing voters' test oaths. For those who are seeking a detailed study of the period, probably the work to consult would be Dr. John Staley's tome, West Virginia's Civil War Era Constitution. I do want to note that Dr. Kenneth Bailey, who's in attendance with us today, reviewed some of my early rough outlines and offered some suggestions. Dr. Bailey authored the book Alleged Evil Genius, The Life and Times of Judge James H. Ferguson, and the article The Notorious Nathaniel Harrison, both of which deal with this subject. And I wish to thank Dr. Bailey for his assistance. Today, as Eric noted, we're going to review elections in the state between 1860 and 1870 and the Reconstruction period, during which Union leaders sought to retain political power through very questionable methods. And this resulted in continued unrest in portions of West Virginia that only ceases with the statewide Democratic victory in 1870. Now think about it. When we go to vote today, usually a poll worker points us to or guides us to a little polling booth, and they make sure, they take special care to ensure our privacy as we vote. The Virginia constitutions prior to the Civil War called for voting by means of viva voce, or with the living voice. This meant that all voters, and of course we're talking about during this time period white males only, but all voters cast their votes orally so that all could hear. The Virginia Constitution read, "Votes shall be given openly or viva voce, not by ballot." 19th century elections in Virginia could be raucous affairs. It was an important day of socialization for a lot of folks who lived in the countryside. This may have been one of the few days that they went to town. Alcohol often made an appearance, and men often demonstrated feats of strength. You know, when we think about elections, one of the things that pops up, Ellison Hatfield, of course, was stabbed at an election, and even though this occurred just across the river in Kentucky, this was one of the central figures, one of the central events in the Hatfield-McCoy feud. Our subject today, however, covers a decade during which nearly half of qualified voters, first of all, chose not to participate in the election that led to the creation of West Virginia, and were later forbidden from not only the right of suffrage, but from other important privileges of citizenship as well. 3 very important elections were held in Virginia, of course, including present-day West Virginia, between November of 1860 and October of 1861 that would change American history. The first of these was the 1860 presidential election, which was held on November 6th. And we can see the different candidates. 4 candidates, of course. Abraham Lincoln was the Republican candidate. The Northern Democrat was Stephen Douglas. The Southern Democrat was a man by the name of John Breckinridge, who was our vice president. And the Constitutional Union Party, which was seen as kind of a moderate party, was represented by John Bell. Bell actually gets the most votes in Virginia, but Breckinridge actually carries present-day West Virginia. That's kind of surprising because, again, he was seen as the fire eater. When this happens, of course, we know that Abraham Lincoln, who receives very few votes in Virginia, he is elected president. And his election leads South Carolina to secede from the Union, followed by 6 other states forming the Confederacy. And then all eyes turn to Virginia. On April 17, 1861, delegates to the Richmond Convention passed the Ordinance of Secession by a vote of 88 to 55. And Virginia voters overwhelmingly ratified this decision on May 23rd, making it official. Voters from northwestern Virginia claimed that their votes weren't counted, while Virginia Governor John Letcher said that the pro-secession vote that was in western Virginia was suppressed. Well, regardless, there's little doubt that the majority of voters in present-day West Virginia were opposed to the Ordinance of Secession. But historians, even today, disagree as to the level of support for leaving the United States. Traditional West Virginia scholars put the number at something like 44,000 to 4,000. In other words, they say 11 to 1 voters of West Virginia oppose secession. I have no idea where they got these numbers, but you see this reported in history books, prominent history books into the 1960s. More recent historians, like Richard Curry, they put numbers at something like 32,000 opposing secession and 19,000 in favor. And that may be a little bit more in line, but that certainly reflects greater secession sentiment. And that's my point here. West Virginia, we think about being a Union state. West Virginia itself was very badly divided. And it's also important to note that many folks who vote against the Ordinance of Secession now side with the Confederacy. They choose their state over their country. That is a long piece of paper. That's Virgil, if you guys, Michael know that. That's in the archives work area. One of the many jewels in the state archives is a collection of poll books from Ritchie County for all 8 precincts from 1843 to 1884. These incredible resources show how each citizen in the county voted in each of these critical elections. In the case of the vote on the Virginia Ordinance of Secession, we also have a chance to see whether the actual vote totals were closer to those postulated by traditional historians or by revisionists like Richard Curry. Now, Curry actually takes a figure that a newspaper noted, which was that 378 was the majority against secession in Ritchie. That's all we had. We didn't know who voted for, against. But he took 80% of eligible voters and used that to come up with these numbers. He calculated that about 30% of Ritchie County's voters favored the ordinance of secession. That's a pretty high number. Well, when we find these and we're able to count the actual totals, this is what they were, 718 to 353. But as you can see, 1/3 of Ritchie County voted to secede from the Union. To me, that's kind of shocking because, you know, you're right next to Wood County on the Ohio River. I don't think about Ritchie County as being somewhere where there was a lot of secession sentiment. And in two of the eight precincts, the majority of voters wanted to leave the Union. That's pretty stunning. Many of the men in Western Virginia soon joined the Confederacy. And for some, this election would be the last one they would participate in for nearly 10 years. They did not participate in the referendum on the new state of Kanawha, which was held on October 24th, 1861, and which was approved by a vote of 18,408 to 781. Some counties that we know are overwhelmingly Confederate in their support cast no votes against the new state. The results of two other votes during the war on the Constitution and then later on the revised Constitution in 1863 were even more overwhelmingly lopsided. There's something suspicious, very suspicious about these results, but the lack of Confederate participation was the primary cause. Many men were out of the area fighting or serving in the Confederate government, and those who remained at home either boycotted the election due to their sentiments or they faced intimidation at the polls. This is kind of an important note. Federal soldiers protected elections in many areas for the next 8 years, and oral voting prior to statehood made retribution a real possibility for Confederate supporters. Shortly after the initial statehood vote in 1861, a Union officer noted that his cavalry unit was posting notices of an upcoming election in Cabell and Wayne Counties. He wrote, "On the day of elections, the polls will be again protected by our forces so that the people may peaceably inaugurate a movement for the establishment of the government and the sustainment of the laws." After the formation of West Virginia and prior to the conclusion of the Civil War, the state makers recognized that returning Confederates, including the former political elite of Western Virginia, combined with Union oppositionists, would be powerful enough to gain political control immediately. In his bicentennial history of West Virginia, John Alexander Williams writes that West Virginia's creators were, quote, trapped in paradoxical circumstances. However democratic the substance and promise of their movement may have been, their opportunities occurred amid conditions that forced them to proceed in arbitrary, undemocratic ways. That kind of sums it up. The leaders of the new state faced a very difficult situation. You know, think about it. How could they accept losing political control to a party that was largely comprised of men who only months before had been their mortal enemies, who had been seeking to destroy the United States and trying to prevent the creation of the very state that you're now trying to control? The prospect of those they had only recently defeated on the battlefield now governing West Virginia must have been appalling to those who had risked everything to support the Union and create a new state. This is what led the fledgling government of West Virginia to take drastic steps to prevent this from occurring. Those who had supported the Confederacy during the conflict would be denied citizenship. They could not hold office or vote or practice law or serve as a juror, or teach school, or sue in the courts, or even offer a defense to suits brought against them in their absence. It's unsurprising that there was unrest during this tumultuous period immediately following 4 years of a bloody war. Efforts by statehood leaders to retain political power in West Virginia began shortly after the state's creation. The first West Virginia Constitution changed the method of voting. Remember that initial Constitution, viva voce, oral voting? This Constitution says, in all elections by the people, the mode of voting shall be by ballot. In other words, we switched the way that we vote. This document also required elected and appointed public officials to take loyalty oaths, swearing that they would support the U.S. and West Virginia constitutions. Now, later legislation was added, a test oath. That meant that those who were taking it had to swear that they had not supported the Confederacy during the war. But again, this is just for elected and appointed public officials. In Cabell County, the vote for the amended West Virginia Constitution, which was in March of '63, was 106-0. An observer noted, quote, "The vote would have been much larger if there had been any assurance of presence or future protection," end quote. Judge Brown was to make a speech at Guyandotte on Election Day, but he went to Cerrito with Union troops because there was an expected attack. Union soldiers protected the town hall and the polls. It was since appeared, the writer added, that the rebel bands were on their way and intended to have prevented the election in Cabell, Wayne, and other counties. We are thankful they did not altogether succeed, although the alarm diminished the number of voters considerably. In the 1864 election, turnout was low in Wayne County because guerrillas were prowling about all the voting precincts in the county. Lincoln carries West Virginia, but 10,000 cast votes for his opponent. And this showed that there was a sizable minority in the state that was opposed to these unconditional unionists, even without the inclusion of Confederate supporters. And this is an important point to follow. When the war erupts and they hold that first Wheeling Convention, people pour in from throughout Western Virginia. And what was their common bond? Support for the Union. They were choosing the United States over Virginia. But as time goes on, as the restored government of Virginia is formed, as the new state of Kanawha is proposed, as emancipation becomes a condition for West Virginia statehood, you have people who kind of drop out in terms of their support. These Union men now resist those who created and then governed the new state. Oppositionists were known as conservatives or conservative unionists, and they were deemed as traitors by unconditional unionists who, of course, later become Republicans. Now, despite the fact that all of these folks support the federal government, it's clear that the creators of West Virginia faced a great deal of opposition from within the Union ranks. Imagine if you add Confederates to that. Violence in parts of West Virginia and the looming return of Confederates led Governor Borman to request that the legislature take action, and they certainly did. On February 25, 1865, a little over a month before Lee's surrender at Appomattox, legislation was passed requiring voters' test oaths. Voters' test oaths. This provided that if a voter were challenged at the polls, they were not permitted to cast their ballot until producing an affidavit swearing they had not supported the Confederacy. In other words, the burden was on them. Citizens also sought methods to deal with returning rebels. Union citizens in one township in Cabell County met at the home of Mrs. Goodman to, quote, deliberate upon the ways and means for the future safety of our township. Their property was still insecure from pillage or theft, while the persons who have committed the robberies and depredations of the last 4 years in this township are still at large and hold themselves secreted in close proximity to our neighborhood. Efforts at disenfranchising voters had unintended consequences. Now you have to remember, when this Constitution was written in 1863 in West Virginia, we had a township system. We actually had a township system here from 1863 until the new one is written in 72. And in many counties, it became nearly impossible to fill township positions due to a lack of qualified citizens. On October 10th, 1865, a writer from Cerrito noted, "The great difficulty is in the laws passed while a portion of the country was in a state of rebellion, providing test oaths, which now prevents the organization of townships because not enough men can be found in them to take the oaths." He added, "We have felt the disadvantage of this for the past 6 months. Townships are unorganized, the free school system is not in operation, roads are unrepaired, and a general stagnation in all public business. The question of modifying the test oath will be an issue. It will be an exciting election. As the date neared, Union officials discovered evidence that the rebels intend to force the inspectors to take their votes Election Day. Officials met with Governor Borman, who ensured them that troops would be present. One of the inspectors noted that we rejected all rebel votes. A former Union officer in Cabell wrote that we have found it necessary at our election to go in arms to protect ourselves against the threatening rebels. James Ferguson of Cabell County later criticized the conduct of the returned rebels at the fall elections. In some of the border counties, they elected rebel officers to the legislature in defiance of the laws of the state, and in others, they actually knocked down and drove from the polls Union men who pretended to challenge their votes. Such men, in my opinion, are not proper subjects for the elective franchise. That doesn't tell the whole story, as Dr. Bailey could tell you. It was really dangerous to serve in any official capacity for West Virginia. Some believe that ex-Confederates were willing to accept federal authority, in other words, the United States government, but they refused to recognize the authority of the new state, which for many of them had been created while they were away. A federal officer noted that the people in that region, quote, are well disposed toward the general government. The inhabitants who have lately been in rebellion yield to it a quiet submission, more probably from compulsion than otherwise. They are by no means favorably disposed toward the state government and avoid or disregard their laws whenever they can do so with impunity. In Wayne County, a mob of former Confederates who swore they would not submit to our laws attacked Union officials at present-day Fort Gay. The mob assaulted the high sheriff with clubs and weights and tried to kill him and his brother. Some of the local home guards were beaten and abused by former Confederates who called them, quote, damned abolitionists and swore they would not submit to our laws, end quote. The assessor of the district informed Governor Borman in early 1866 that it is with extreme difficulty and under great danger and hard threats that I am getting along. He added that federal troops must be sent to the area, quote, or else we must get out of here. At about the same time, a deputy U.S. Marshal in Wayne County wrote that ex-Confederates are getting very sassy. I love that. I have to start on my business, and I am very much alarmed at this time, but have to go in, and if they see fit to murder me, they will have to do it, for I am bound to do my business or die in the defense of my government. In addition to continued violence, state leaders also recognized that the voters' test oath simply hadn't worked. You had a future West Virginia governor, Henry Matthews, who had been a Confederate officer, who was elected to the state Senate. And Samuel Price, who had been a lieutenant governor of Confederate Virginia, is elected as a judge. Well, neither of these men are allowed to assume their offices, but it's evident, that Union leaders would have to resort to more drastic measures to prevent former Confederates from playing a role in the political realm of the new state. And they would. In his annual address to the legislature in 1866, Governor Borman said, "It has seemed to me that too great anxiety is manifested on the part of those who actively engaged in the rebellion to repossess themselves of place and power. They are too impatient under the safeguards that it has seemed necessary to adopt for the protection of the government. It has scarcely been 9 months since they were in rebellion, yet they now gravely insist upon the right to immediate participation in making and administering the laws. It must be apparent that time should be taken on this subject." Well, the legislature responded with repressive measures. Test oaths would be required of all attorneys who had to swear that they hadn't borne arms since the formation of West Virginia. More significant was a proposed constitutional amendment, in addition to the first section of Article 3, adding that no person who since June 1, 1861 has aided in rebellion shall be a citizen or be allowed to vote. Again, shall be a citizen or allowed to vote. This amendment would be ratified by the voters of West Virginia, stripping between 15,000 and 25,000 West Virginians of their citizenship. And the logic seems perplexing. How can a citizen of the United States not be a citizen of a state? This legislation in 1866 also created 3-member county boards of registration appointed by the governor, which were then to appoint registrars in each township. And only those who could take the voter's test oath were permitted on the voting rolls. The boards of registration had tremendous power. Even if an individual took the test oath, they could be stripped of their suffrage rights arbitrarily. Joseph F. Caldwell, Dr. Bailey knows that name well, from Greenbrier County, struck so many names from the voting rolls that his nickname became Old Scratch. Reflective of his sentiments, he informed Judge Nathaniel Harrison, "From my observation of the deportment of the rebel, and I consider the conservative only another name for the rebel, I find the more they are favored, the more arrogant do they become, and that we should be vigilant in our exertions to exclude them from political power." They were pretty good at it. He informed Borman that the rebels made desperate efforts to prevent the 1866 election, but he also noted that the act of registration has excluded from voting all the leading rebels and about 3/4 of the county's citizens. That's a lot of people that can't vote. Criticisms of Caldwell were numerous. A Greenbrier County delegate wrote Governor Borman concerning his, quote, convictions as to the motives which govern this old man. And I express today the conviction, which has been deepening for months past, that he should either be locked up in a jail or confined in an asylum. I thought that was beautiful. There were continual complaints about the arbitrary actions of the registrars. It wasn't just Caldwell. And grievances at times led to attacks on election officials, the destruction of poll books, and cases of individuals just coming in and seizing the voting book and adding their names to it, just writing their names right in the book. Governor Borman received other letters, however, not from disenfranchised individuals, but from persons complaining that the registrars were sometimes not strict enough, and that political considerations, rather than wartime activities, sometimes determined who would be stricken from the rolls. Some Union leaders believed that if former Confederates gained political control of West Virginia, they might pursue reunification with Virginia. While the practicality of this may seem questionable, this week Kyle Warmack provided me with a copy of a letter in the Harrison County Historical Society written by Virginia Governor Francis Pierpont to West Virginia Congressman Chester Hubbard in March of 1866 that exhibited this very sentiment. I am no alarmist, but there is trouble ahead. Your places and your state is part of the prize that is being played for. I see no hope for a reconciliation between President and Congress. If they should get the power, the first act will be to wipe out all test oaths. The next will be to wipe out West Virginia. Just as sure as you live, here is the intent. That was wonderful. Thank you, Kyle. Republicans carried the 1866 election by a vote of 24,000 to 17,000. The results aided considerably by the absence of former Confederates. During the political campaign in Wayne County, a secret organization sprung up amongst the late rebels and their sympathizers to support President Andrew Johnson, who was facing possible impeachment. According to a Union official, they openly threatened that they would rise on a given night and butcher all the radicals in power should his impeachment be attempted. Immediately following the election, Union men who had won county and state offices were warned not to accept their positions, and an attack was attempted on a former Union officer who served in the House of Delegates. Federal troops were finally sent to Cabell and Wayne Counties in early 1867 after armed guerrillas freed one of their comrades from the Wayne County jail. Additional legislation was approved in 1867. Jurors now had to be registered voters, eliminating former Confederates from the jury pool. And teachers were also now required to take the test oath. Not surprisingly, hostility toward registration boards increased. Jay Burkett, registrar for a township in Randolph County, contacted Governor Borman in early 1867 and shared the contents of an anonymous note he received 2 days earlier. We give you notice in this way because we can't get justice done here by law, that you must leave this place within 2 months or abide by the consequence. Your life and property will be in danger after that time. A postscript added, you've been acting the hypocrite long enough, so it has played out. The letter was one of many threats that were made against Union men in Randolph. The fact is this, Burkett wrote ominously, that society here is about as ripe for another rebellion as in the spring of 1861. The state of society is tenfold worse than I expected. The majority is bitterly rebel, and by an indiscriminate system of registering, they have succeeded in electing disloyal men to all the county and state offices. The registrars and boards of registration desire to purify the ballot box and have, in the discharge of their duties, aroused the whole swarm. And I very much fear that if we do not have some help to keep the peace, it may end in bloodshed. I do not know what is best to be done. We would prefer to do without an armed force if possible, but really the future is threatening. He also added that the former Confederates, quote, have drawn the line and will not patronize Union men or associate with them in any shape or form. They have gone so far as to call meetings and pass resolutions to that effect. Imagine that. These guys were pariahs. Union men were pariahs in a lot of these counties. In Tucker County, however, the registrars were able to strike off a considerable number. One of them noted the business before the board all passed off quietly. No person attempted to thwart the board or any office. I thought this was interesting, though. Among those who were rejected were the Tucker County sheriff, his deputy, the assessor, two of the supervisors, and several of the inspectors of elections. Now, I'm not sure what happened in Tucker County, but in most cases, these men would have been disqualified, obviously, from holding office. And in counties, again, that had been overwhelmingly in support of the Confederacy, it was still 3 years after the war nearly impossible to find people who could take the test oath and hold down these offices. A federal detachment had arrived in Logan County, and they discovered that the county was not organized, and a year later it still was not organized. One of the officers wrote, "I found that the only obstacle is the test oath of the state. And when the offices are filled, the incumbents only succeed by the aid of men who are in other respects qualified but cannot take the test oath." In 1868, you start to see some Republicans advocate for what was known as a let-up policy. Let's bring them back in. Let's give citizenship rights back to ex-Confederates. Over the next 2 years, an increasing number of prominent Union men would join this chorus. And questions continued over the constitutional issue of that constitutional amendment, taking citizenship rights away. In July of 1868, the Attorney General of West Virginia was contacted by Governor Borman about that, about the citizenship status of ex-Confederates, and he basically concluded that the U.S. Constitution obviously was the supreme law of the land, and if that was the case, then it was Melvin's opinion that, yes, former Confederates were citizens, and therefore they would have all these citizenship rights. Despite his judgment, the judicial branch continually upheld legislation passed during this period. In fact, there doesn't appear to be a single case regarding the constitutionality of all these restrictions that were placed on former Confederates that was overturned by the Supreme Court. Not a single case. Disenfranchised citizens found no relief from the judicial branch of government. Unrest continued to increase. Federal troops were stationed in various parts of West Virginia, including the counties of Barber and Cabell and Logan and Marion and Monroe and Randolph and Tucker and Wayne. A Cabell County official wrote to General George H. Thomas in June of 1868, "In our county and adjacent counties, there is a regularly organized band of horse thieves and robbers who have been terrifying all classes of citizens to an alarming extent. And owing to the mountainous region of this country, the civil authorities have been powerless. But since the arrival of U.S. forces here, we have enjoyed peace and quiet, and for this reason, we pray the furtherance of the protection." The writer added that at no time since the surrender of Lee at Appomattox on the 9th day of April 1865 has this place stood more in need of military troops than at the present time. For in addition to the causes set forth in this petition, it is a well-known fact that the KKK are organizing throughout this and the adjoining counties for no good purpose, we know. And already the rebels are becoming emboldened. 2 members of the Braxton County Board of Registration resigned in the summer of 1868, and as a result, prospects for enforcing voting restrictions in Braxton County were bleak. Henry Bender wrote from Salt Lick Bridge on August 14th describing the situation. As regards the rebel element, we have every reason to believe that they purpose giving us trouble in this county. They have threatened the Board of Registration and swear that if they erase any more from the books, that the Ku Klux will erase them. A number of rebels, including rebel soldiers, have been heard to say that they would go to the election this fall and vote or destroy the ballot boxes. In fact, it appears from their actions that they intend to bid defiance to the law. The consequence, I fear, will be that a number of our Union people will be deterred from going to the election. Even now, some of the more timid say that unless we can have some assurance that they will not go to the election. Quite a number of rebels have lately been seen armed, and the general impression is that there is a considerable organization of the Ku Klux Klan in this county to which the rebel party here are mostly attached. If we had 50 or 60 bluecoats or a company of our own men organized and equipped, all would be safe. Was the KKK prevalent in West Virginia? Well, undoubtedly, they did exist here. But oftentimes, I think that the mention of them in these letters was designed to increase the chances of federal troops being sent to a region. Such threats against Union officials were still common. Again, we're talking 3 years after the war, and we're still having these threats on a daily basis. On September 7, 1868, John S. Witcher, who had been a Union general, a member of the legislature, he was currently serving as the Secretary of State, and he was running for Congress at the time, wrote to Borman from Fayette Courthouse. I am of the opinion, from all I can find out, that we will have trouble with the rebels in Cabell, Lincoln, and Boone counties. I am of the opinion that they will attempt to register by force. I am sure that they will give us trouble unless we can get a few troops here and in Cabell. Witcher had recently visited Peytona down in Boone County, where the residents, quote, swore that no damn Grant man could speak or live in that neighborhood, end quote. Witcher had also been threatened that very day prior to penning his correspondence. They were about to mob me here today. I thought at one time I should be mobbed sure, as they threatened my life openly. Again, we're not talking about just some guy on the street. This guy's our Secretary of State. He's a former Union general. It's just kind of mind-blowing to me that someone like that would face that violence. On this very same day that Witcher writes this letter, former Confederates attacked voter registration boards across Cabell County, quote, forcing themselves on the registrars, and succeeded in getting about 200 names in the register, and swear that the Board of Registration shall not take their names off the register, as they intend to vote in spite of all the opposition that can be brought against them, end quote. In response to the threats on the electoral process, the federal commander in the region issued a special order which was designed to protect these boards of registration, and detachments of soldiers were sent to Boone, to Cabell, Lincoln, and Wayne counties. The unit that got sent to Barbersville had to remain a few days after the election because the registrar's life was threatened. In that 1868 election, Republicans won, but the vote was very close. On March 3, 1869, the legislature ratified the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution, giving African Americans the right to vote. Former Confederates, of course, were still disenfranchised, and this action by Republicans stirred a great deal of animosity in the state. Racist attitudes were prevalent in West Virginia, and in fact, throughout much of the country at this time. Many West Virginians supported the end of slavery, but they did not consider African Americans as equals, and some were appalled that they had been given voting rights, while former Confederates, men that they had known all their lives, men with whom they had been business partners or lifelong neighbors, had been stripped of those privileges. This undoubtedly adds to the numbers opposing the actions of radical Republicans in West Virginia. In March 1869, Governor William Stevenson learned that all federal troops were to be withdrawn from the state. He wrote to Senator Borman, and said, order, I suppose, prevails now in counties where these troops were stationed, but there may be trouble when the boards of registration meet in the summer or before, and I am anxious to be posted as to what I may depend upon if troops should be needed. There were complaints in Cabell County in the middle of 1869 that the governors had not appointed members to the Board of Registration. No registrars had been qualified. In September, several folks had gotten little notices in the mail that they had been stricken from the voting rolls. They were particularly angered by the fact that these notices did not include the names of the members of the Board of Registration. It didn't say when the meeting was. It just said, you're off. Radical Republicans lost most of their seats in the legislature in 1869 election, which in most areas of the state passed off quietly. On January 18, 1870, Governor Stevenson urged the removal of political disabilities against ex-Confederates. In response, the testos for teachers and attorneys were struck down. And during this session, we see a proposed constitutional amendment by Senator W.H.H. Flick, which would give all males, both ex-Confederates, African Americans, the right to vote. The Flick Amendment, as was known, would be ratified by voters in 1871, but by then it was already settled. Democrats had already come to power. And that happens in that fall election of 1870. They win both houses of the legislature and the governorship. The vote was very close, and there were certainly a number of different reasons for Democrats coming back to power in West Virginia. Dr. Bailey pointed out that not only did men from both parties desire to promote economic development in the state, to attract capital investment in the state, but also young voters who had not fought in the war may have been more willing to reach across party lines. Ratification of the 15th Amendment also had an adverse effect on Republican efforts to retain power. More importantly, federal legislation, which had been intended to protect the rights of African Americans, known as the Enforcement Act of 1870, was used by federal district judge John Jackson to aid former Confederates in voting in that specific election. And it was just enough. That vote total, 28,020 to 26,475, so very close. African American voters cast their ballots for the first time in Cabell County, and some of those former Confederates who had been deprived of their right to vote for years also voted and were instrumental in the results. Democrats were determined to fix the governing document written in wartime by their enemies, and a convention was held which resulted in the 1872 Constitution, the document which governs our state today. At this convention were 66 Democrats and 12 Republicans, the latter including Waitman T. Willey, the former U.S. Senator who had been instrumental in the creation of West Virginia and had been defeated in his effort at re-election in 1871. And I just always think about Waitman Willey, this guy who's been instrumental in creating this state. And he's sitting on the back row during this constitutional convention, just watching all these things he created being destroyed. In regard to voting, this new constitution read, "In all elections by the people, the mode of voting shall be by ballot, but the voter shall be left free to vote by either open, sealed, or secret ballot as he may elect." I didn't go into the details in terms of the debate, but I know that there was sentiment at that 1872 that Constitutional Convention to reintroduce viva voce or oral voting, but it didn't happen. In closing, it's easy to understand the frustration felt by former Confederates at the restrictions placed upon them in the aftermath of the Civil War. They were willing to abide by the constitutions, pay their taxes, do their civic duties, but they were nonetheless stripped of their citizenship. On the other hand, what course could have been taken by the men who created West Virginia? How could they turn the reins over so quickly to their former enemies? And if no restrictions had been placed on ex-Confederates, if they had gained power in 1865 like expected instead of 1870, how would that have affected the history of our state? Would it have eliminated 5 years of violence and unrest? I don't know. I'll certainly look forward to hearing your thoughts on this. This is certainly one of the most fascinating periods in our state's history, and yet there is a great deal of research and writing scholarship yet to be done. I want to thank you very much for your attention and your patience. Thank you. No, I'm not aware of any. I know that there were several instances where attorneys, for example, were permitted to practice law despite the fact that, but I think they were more in regard to technical matters, would you say, Dr. Bailey, rather than addressing the specifics of the constitutionality of it. I'm not aware of anything. Of course, we know that the Jefferson-Berkeley County dispute ends up in front of the Supreme Court, but that's the only one of which I'm aware. But I've not gone into detailed research on that.
As I recall, the state appeals court at that time decided that, and this was actually in a decision, that if the public of West Virginia had elected the legislature, they were not in a position to overturn the laws. However, as Joe mentioned, there were a couple of instances in which they found ways around the law. There was an attorney who wanted to practice, and he was denied the right to practice simply because he was, because of the prohibition against former Confederates serving as officers of the state. And he successfully argued that he wasn't an officer of the state, that lawyers didn't hold that position. And those types of things were what they used to get around the legislation, and there were only a handful of those kinds of cases.
It seems like a lot of historians focus on the Civil War and kind of stop at that. Our textbooks taught us misconceptions for so many years in terms of West Virginia, why we were created, that we were a good Union state, that we were all opposed to slavery and so on. When you start digging into it a little deeper, you find that we were very badly divided here in West Virginia. And I know there's a gentleman by the name of Scott McKenzie who will be coming out with a new book within the next year on statehood. So I know John Alexander Williams talks about the fact that a defensiveness almost about the way in which we were created, about the questions that even today arise about the constitutionality of our creation. So again, I think we've taken a lot of these things at face value, that like that vote 44,000 to 4,000, that we were all opposed to secession. When we finally get into studying these specific documents, we find that wasn't the case. So I don't know why necessarily it's not been gone into. It may be because it is a little confusing, a little tough to follow. In terms of what I did, the Borman papers, obviously, you're getting a picture there from one perspective. What we have there, the Richard County, in terms of the actual votes and elections themselves, we don't have a lot of evidence because records are disposed of, whether they should be or not, but a lot of records have this retention schedules, so you keep them so long and you get rid of them. So we may not have voting records showing that. I was blown away when I found out about those Richard County poll books. Basically, it was an authorization to destroy request from the county. And when I saw the dates and the description, I jumped in the car that afternoon and drove up there. And they're not bound together books. It actually, now they're in 4 different boxes. They're torn apart. But that one thing that I showed you, that's kind of one precinct for one election folded out. And they do give you a specific. So yeah, the voting itself, I think, may be a little harder to find. There are good resources, I still think, in terms of writing that history, but it's in a lot of different places and a lot of different resources. But Dr. Bailey, I know, did a great deal of research on this, and I kind of wished that he would go to the finish line with a study of that Reconstruction period, because again, and I think even this topic is, there's probably enough there for a good study.
I think one of the problems too is that topics such as this, while they interest us, don't interest the general, maybe reading public, and they're frankly, even a little boring for historians at times when you start thinking about legal cases, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's a whole lot more interesting to people to hear about a big battle and the generals involved, all that kind of stuff. And then you get into these kinds of things, which are very important, but peripheral to what folks are interested in.
That's a great point. I mean, we have some, fascinating election history in West Virginia. We think about the Lever brothers and Kennedy campaigning here and all the different things. But this is one of those periods that's so unique in terms of having a large percentage of the population that choose not to participate and then finally are forbidden from participating. So for a 10-year period, you had a block of people who weren't, despite the fact that they were citizens. I would think that, possibly there would be, if there are papers of Price or some of these other prominent folks, but primarily that perspective would be presented through newspapers, those Democratic newspapers. I know the Cabell County Press was a very Democratic paper, and so they're angry at all of the measures being taken. So you do get it from there, and you're going to get letters in there, obviously, from that slant as well. But it might be a little hard, it certainly would be a little harder to find that perspective than the union perspective, because we have their official papers and they're holding offices and such.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you so much.